Hi everybody, welcome to a Spectrum Economics video. Today I'm going to go back to two very basic concepts, and that is demand and supply. Many economists consider demand and supply to be the backbone of economics. And whether that's true or not, we might debate that a little bit later in the session. We won't be going into too much detail on that. But the focus of today's video is just going to be simply explaining what we mean by demand and supply. So let's start with demand. So what is demand? Basically, demand is a person's willingness and ability to pay for something. It's typically represented by a downward sloping demand curve. As you can see here, this is what you'd normally see in your textbooks. So why is it downward sloping? Put it this way. Imagine you've got an apple. The first apple you have, you may like it a lot. You may be very hungry, and your demand will be pretty high for that one apple. And you'll be willing to pay more money for that one apple. But after you've eaten, let's say, 2 or 3 apples, you'll start to feel full, or maybe you'll get a little bit sick of apples. So the 4th or 5th apple, you're not going to be willing to pay as much money for that apple. So as we reach the higher quantities you can see here from the downward sloping demand curve, you'll be willing to pay less money for maybe 4 apples than you would maybe for just one, for your first apple, should I say. Let's now take a look at supply. So supply is typically represented as an upward sloping curve or upward sloping line. So supply is basically what the producers produce. So in the case of apples, it's the number of apples that a producer will pick. So as price goes up, the producer will be willing to produce or pick more apples, or grow more apples, should we say. And also more firms will be willing to enter. And as the price keeps going up, the quantity of apples that firms are willing to supply is going to keep increasing. So that's why we have an upward sloping supply curve. So let's now put demand and supply together. So when demand and supply interact, they cross over each other, as you can see here from this diagram, we can get the equilibrium, and that's the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. And that is supposedly what the good will sell at and how many of that particular good it will sell at. This works well if you've got homogeneous goods. Basically, every single seller is selling the same thing. All the apples are the same. And people all have the same tastes. And there's also not an awful lot of change. But as I'll show you in a minute, that sometimes equilibrium is not as easy to achieve as just simply having demand equal to supply. Often we have what we call incomplete information. So in other words, the suppliers may not necessarily know what the price is going to be at a given time. And also, people that are demanding certain things may not necessarily know the quality of what they're demanding. So we may have a situation, as we see here in this diagram, where the producers are willing to sell a certain amount, but the demand isn't as high as they expected. So they're thinking that the price is going to be one thing, and it turns out that it's a lot lower. So therefore, the producers would therefore adjust how much they supply to the level of what the price was previously. And that could then result in an insufficient supply. And then that will cause them to increase their supply again. And you get this sort of cobweb effect where the price goes up and down, up and down. And hopefully you're going to be working towards an equilibrium. But that's not always the case. That comes down to now what we call elasticity of supply and elasticity of demand. So you need to have a more inelastic supply than your demand in order for you to actually get this cobweb effect that's going to result in an equilibrium. So what I've explained so far is what we call a partial equilibrium. So that's just looking at one market. And it's not looking at what happens in other markets. So for example, we had apples. So we're just looking at solely what's happening with apples. We're not looking at what's happening with apple seeds. We're not looking at what's happening with apple pies, for example. We're not looking at what's happening with pears or bananas or any other goods that may some way or other be related to apples. So it's very, very simplistic. So we can't take just simply looking at demand and supply too seriously by itself. But we need to consider it basically as a concept that can help us understand how price can be determined. But is that the only way of looking at things? Well, definitely not. Is it the best way of looking at things? Again, that comes down to perspective, but there's also a number of other things that you may want to look at that actually leads into supply and actually has more effect than simply just looking at price and quantity of a particular good. So here are the other areas you might want to consider. First off, utility, and I've actually got a few posts and I've got a few videos regarding utility. So utility is the satisfaction or enjoyment you actually get out of something. And utility actually feeds into demand, and it's actually a very important part of demand. So something that gives you a very high utility, you're going to be willing to pay a lot more money for. Whereas something that gives you hardly any utility, you won't want to pay as much. And also utility affects as well in the sense that what is your rate of diminishing utility? So for example, we mentioned about the apples, 2 or 3 apples you may not want anymore. There'll be other things that, you may want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and they all give you around the same level of utility and satisfaction. And that will actually shape your demand curve. Perception is another thing that's important as well. People have different perceptions about different things. So, for example, people see things very, very highly, for example, like you look at certain luxury goods, and people will want to have those luxury goods to fit in as part of the crowd. So it is that perception of something, even it may not actually give them value utility in itself, but it has the perception of giving that value. Also efficiency, this is talking about into supply now, and the more efficient you are in producing something, the lower the price would be. So in effect, if you can lower the price, you'll be shifting the supply curve downwards, and therefore in effect you'll be able to produce more of something even though the price might be lower. Choice again relates to perception. Perception influences our choice, and we choose between various different types of goods. So for example, you may choose your apple, or you may choose your banana, or you may choose your pear. And it's important to understand how that factors in, and you can't necessarily get that when we're looking at just a partial equilibrium. So that's when I'll talk about general equilibrium in another video. Ownership of factors of production, and also the market structure and how that affects the market structure. So for example, you may have a company, for example, that owns all the factors of production and in effect form a monopoly. And if it's a monopoly, then they can be able to control price, and in effect they'll be able to charge higher and actually earn more profits, though at the same time the consumer is going to suffer. So all of these factors here influence both price and quantity, but it can't easily be just shown within a simple demand and supply function and equations. It goes a little bit beyond that, and these are things that need to be understood before we actually look at what the demand and supply actually is. So as I mentioned earlier, looking at demand and supply concepts is very interesting, and they certainly have a great amount of relevance. Like for example, you look at the relationship with price and quantity. So the downward sloping demand curve, it's perfectly true that the higher the price, the less of a particular good someone will want. Also, the lower the price, the more of a particular good that someone will want. And also you have diminishing returns as well. We also have to bear in mind that a lot of factors feed into demand that we don't always know about. The same thing with supply as well. The general relationship of an upward supply curve is more or less correct. As price goes up, more firms will enter, or existing firms will produce more. So all of that logic is correct in regards to the price and quantity. Again, things we don't know, though, is about changes in technology and the different techniques that different firms are using as well. So there's a lot of incomplete information that makes achieving an equilibrium very difficult just looking at demand and supply in themselves. And on top of that as well, there's different regulation that comes in too, and also taxation that comes in. So all these other factors also influence the price and the quantity. And also equilibrium generally is not stable, as price and quantity will be changing simply because of things like changing tastes over time, new competitors entering and old ones leaving, and of course changes in technology. And certain industries, technology is constantly changing, especially when we're looking at things such as computers. So bearing in all those factors, we can't just rely on demand and supply to get our price, especially when we're looking at partial equilibrium. I'll explain in another video more about general equilibrium and how that works as well. That brings me to the end of my explanation of demand and supply. I hope you enjoyed it. I got several other videos, some of them also relating to demand and supply as well. I mostly look at things relating to applied economics rather than straight out concepts. But demand and supply is something that's often talked about, and it is one of the first year things that you look at in an economics textbook, and is taught in first year courses. So I thought I would dedicate a video to this, just so, just for reference. Anyway, if you like this video, remember to hit the like button. If you want to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe button. Also, you can, if you're watching this on DTube, remember to hit the follow button and also hit the like or the upvote button. Thank you very much, and hopefully you'll be hearing from more of me soon. Goodbye.